Well, it's official. Democrats in Massachusetts, they're going to have a primary contest for next year when it comes to one of the state's U.S. Senate seats. That after Congressman Joe Kennedy III, grandson of the late Bobby Kennedy, officially entered the race this past weekend.
Donald Trump has forced a reckoning in our nation, without question. But to meet this moment requires more than just defeating him. It requires taking on, clearly, a broken system, the calcified structures that allowed him to win in the first place. The daily acts of oppression and injustice that enabled 63 million Americans to think that he was a better steward of their dreams and hopes and aspirations.
Now, if you just heard that clip here, it sure sounds like Kennedy's running against Donald Trump. In fact, he's running against incumbent Ed Markey. So why the primary challenge, you ask? Well, it's not necessarily because of their views. Markey and Kennedy are actually pretty close in the political spectrum. In fact, Markey's so well known as a progressive that he and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they were the co-sponsors of the Green New Deal back in February, complete with this photo of AOC even kissing Markey at the presser. She's expected to endorse Markey, who's been pushing on that climate issue for more than a decade, and she'll take his support or push for him over the Kennedy challenge. So if Kennedy's challenge isn't about policy, what is it about? Could it be age or a generational thing? Kennedy, after all, is nearly half the age of Markey. Kennedy 38, Markey 73. It could also be personal ambition. Kennedy thinking the time is right to try and jump to the Senate. Well, a new poll out over the weekend certainly gives Kennedy the early edge. He's up 9.5 points here in a Boston Globe Suffolk University poll. And for more, let's turn to Joe Battenfeld. Joe is a political columnist with the Boston Herald, and he's kind enough to give us a few minutes. I know not a shocker that he got in, but nonetheless, it's surprising to see this kind of infighting, certainly in Democratic ranks. Why is Kennedy getting in? Is it timing, or does he see a vulnerability of Markey that he thinks, well, the opportunity should be now?
I think it's partly he does see a vulnerability in Ed Markey. Markey, although he's been a congressman and a senator in the state for over 40 years, a lot of people still don't know him that well, and he hasn't really forged a big identity. So Markey, in that respect, is vulnerable. And of course, we have the Kennedy name, which still means a lot in this state. It's not as much as it used to mean, but it's still a huge advantage in the state just to have that Kennedy as a last name. But why he's running is really the central question of his campaign. It's a question he's going to have to answer repeatedly on the campaign trail. He hasn't really totally answered yet. He said basically, I want to fix a broken system. I want to show up for people in Massachusetts, but those aren't really big, broad themes, except I'm running against Donald Trump.
To that end, does Markey have himself to blame to a certain thing in that he opened the door a few times without fully committing that he was definitely running again, and when he made his mind up, he gave a window of time there for Kennedy to try and fill the void?
Yeah, I think Markey is partly to blame, and like I said, partly because he hasn't really forged a big identity in this state, and he really needs to get better at telling people who he is and what he stands for. Obviously, the Green New Deal is a huge thing for Markey. He's going to run on the Green New Deal all campaign and mention that as much as he possibly can, because that's his signature bill right now before the Senate.
You know, Joe, you mentioned the Kennedy legacy, and I try to explain to folks who aren't from Massachusetts, really New England, but Massachusetts, there was a time not that many years ago, I got a lot of family in Massachusetts, where they could do the whole Kennedy family tree. Yes, it's maybe from a certain generation, but nonetheless, it can't be exaggerated, especially in today's politics, just how much the name still carries in Massachusetts.
I mean, it's been about 10 years since Senator Kennedy died, but there's been, obviously, Joe Kennedy came after Senator Kennedy, ran for Congress, easily won, has won all 3 times. He's run without any difficulty. So, but that's for Congress. He's got to run statewide now. And the fact that he's ahead by 9 points in the polls without even campaigning yet, I think says what the Kennedy name still means in this state. A lot of people don't know him that well, except the fact that he is a Kennedy. But I think he's going to have to jump beyond that in the coming weeks and explain to people why exactly he's running too.
at the risk of getting way too ahead of ourselves, Warren has certainly seen an uptick in her chances on the national trail. In fact, polls out over the weekend saying she's even leading in Iowa. That all said, conceivably there could be an additional opening for a Senate seat in Massachusetts. I was surprised that she threw her weight behind Markey. And not that I thought she'd support Kennedy, but I thought she'd stay out of it altogether. Why did Elizabeth Warren get behind Markey?
Well, I think that's a good question. Partly it's timing. Warren endorsed Ed Markey before she knew Joe Kennedy was even interested in getting in the race. So she kind of trapped herself. And now, Joe Kennedy was her law student in law school. And they're very close, and they've campaigned together. Joe Kennedy is up in New Hampshire campaigning for her presidential campaign, so they're very close. So it's going to be a very difficult thing for her to sort of navigate whether she's supporting Senator Markey. She can't take it back now and say, no, I take back my endorsement, so she's got to endorse him. But she's going to, I think, talk as good as she can about Joe Kennedy every chance she can.
And Joe, I mentioned the poll numbers and the spread right now around 9 points. I know really early. Let's get the disclaimers out of the way. That said, is the betting money here that, between the party machine or moreover really the infrastructure and the ability to raise money is only maybe a Kennedy can there, that it'd be a surprise if Kennedy doesn't win this thing?
I think it would be a surprise if he doesn't win. I think he has a built-in edge, 9 points. Not a great, huge lead at this point, but significant, like I said, considering the fact that he hadn't even been in the race when the poll was taken. So people here clearly have a fondness for the Kennedy name, the Kennedy family still. That's what's taking him to the edge in the polls right now. But can he sustain it? That's the big question.
Well, we're going to see. Joe Battenfeld, I really appreciate a few minutes with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
All right, everybody, stay with us. RFL will be right back right after this.